Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Nina Eidsheim. I'm professor of musicology and founder and director of the Practice-Based Experimental Epistemology Research Lab, or PEER Lab, at UCLA. We've spent the past year working quietly at our kitchen tables and then in our backyards, and it's so nice to finally welcome you to our inaugural public event. We're still in an experimental phase, working in different modules, including research groups that we welcome you to join. And I'm going to put the link in the chat right now. Across all our projects, we pay attention to how oppressed groups and individuals survive, pursue knowledge, and express joy through music and sound. And in doing so, the lab seeks to understand what it is to be human. All peer lab work is centered around creative practice. And today's event focuses on the multisensory practice of writing books. Specifically, we have asked 4 esteemed authors to reflect on what sound or music carried them while writing. Consider, how does music affect the pace, the urgency of your practice? Might it make itself into the shape or the prose or the form of the book itself? How does it change the flavor of your work? The question might be, what is the soundtrack to your creativity? At the lab, we think about our events as family meals, test kitchens, and pop-up labs. At today's family meal, we hope to have the kind of conversation one might have while sitting around a plentiful table under an orange tree in an LA backyard. Imagine what the guests will share as a wonderful dish offered in such a setting. A few words about how the program will run today. First, I will introduce my dear friends and co-editors of the Refiguring American music series and co-hosts of today's event, Josh and Ron. Ron will then introduce the Refiguring American music series and the authors we'll speak with today. After that, we'll have a conversation with each of the authors. And during that time, please feel free to post questions in the chat. I will moderate them, and then we'll have a question answer period at the very end. So now I'm so incredibly honored to introduce Ronald Rodano, an ethnomusicologist who specializes in the history of US Black music and its transnational circulation. He recently became Professor Emeritus of both music and African cultural studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Radano is the author of 2 award-winning books, New Musical Figurations, Anthony Braxton's Cultural Critique, and Lying Up a Nation, Race and Black Music. He is the co-editor of Music and the Racial Imagination, as well as Audible Empire, Music, Global Politics, Critique. In addition, he served as a co-editor for the Chicago Studies in Ethnomusicology for over a decade. Some of his many recognitions include the Guggenheim and a fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin, where he launched a new project on early sound recording, phonographic knowledge, and the African past. We're especially excited about his new book, Alive in the Sound, Black Music, Value, Counter History, which is forthcoming with our very own RAM series. Josh Kuhn is professor and chair in cross-cultural communication at the University of Southern California, and author and editor of several books, including Audiotopia, Music, Race, and America. His work focuses on the arts, music, and politics of cultural connection, with an emphasis on archives, global migration, and Los Angeles. As a curator and artist, he has collaborated with institutions including the Getty Foundation, SF MoMA, and the California African American Museum, as well as the Los Angeles Public Library, where he has led a series of celebrated projects based on their special collections. He co-curates the Kala Crossfade Lab in Phoenix, Arizona, and is the board chair of Alma Backyard Farms in Compton, California. Some of his recognitions include a MacArthur Fellowship and the Berlin Prize. His current projects include an artistic commission for Prospect 5 opening this fall in New Orleans, and his new book on music and displacement in the 21st century, to be published by MCD Books, Farrar, Straus, and Gerard. And before I pass it on to Ron, I want to thank everybody who has helped make this event possible. Thank you to Ron, to Josh, to Duke University Press, and to Ken Whisaker, who's here today. Thank you, Ken. And to our Peer Lab team, our wonderful authors, and everyone who's joined us this morning and afternoon and whichever time zone you are in. And finally, as a land-grant institution, we also want to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of this region. So I pass it on to you, Ron.
Thank you, Nina. And thank you all for joining us today. Before introducing our 4 featured speakers, let me say a little bit about the series and how it came into being. Refiguring American Music really comes out of a series of conversations that took place a couple of decades ago at the annual meetings of the American Studies Association, having to do with the weak representation of music on the conference's sessions. And this occlusion of music from the programs was occurring at the same time that a number of key figures, Penny von Eschen, Herman Gray, Robin Kelly, Sherry Tucker, Eric Porter, to just name a few, were actively pursuing music projects. And it was Ken Whisaker, in his capacity as editor-in-chief of Duke University Press, who recognized the potential for a book series that would help to push new directions in American musical scholarship. And in initial conversations that also included Charlie McGovern, we imagined a series that would capitalize on the new musical turn in American studies, while also benefiting from the move toward critical and theoretical writing in the musicologies. Once Refiguring American Music was formally launched in 2006, it quickly established itself with influential titles by Carl Miller, Tim Taylor, Michael Awkward, Alison McCracken, Barry Shank, and others. But the current look of RAM came about when Josh joined the fold shortly after the series began, helping us to broaden the scope of our representation by bringing in works by Oliver Wang, Fred Moten, Alexander Vasquez, and more. Then, in 2017, we were able to coax Nina to join us with the added benefit of bringing to the series her remarkable book, The Race of Sound. If you check out our series page on the press website, you'll read that, and this is a quote, Refiguring American Music publishes broad, innovative works that pose new challenges to thinking about the nature and character of American music. That conception has evolved over the past 15 years in step with trends in scholarship. But what carries through all of the 34 published works is a commitment to the idea of refiguring, to rewriting standard narratives, to redrawing conceptual boundaries, to reimagining what acts of writing about music should look and feel like. Refiguring is meant to suggest interventions into practice and form. From the outset, those interventions have focused on matters of critique, aesthetics and politics, modes of listening, how history is composed, who and what get represented. Ultimately, the idea of refiguring is meant to suggest not just a new orientation to scholarship, but also a way of reconceiving the matter of writing itself. It is with an attention to writing that we'll hear from the series' most recently published authors, who will be reflecting on the practice of listening as it has informed the craft of their new works, the crafting of their new works. Shanna Redmond, professor of music and African American studies at UCLA, will speak to the writing of her stunning book, Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson, which not only opens up a different way of understanding Robeson, but also sets new ground for the writing of biography. Then we'll hear from Anthony Reed, Associate Professor of English at Vanderbilt, who will speak to ways of listening as they inform the making of Soundworks, Race, Sound, and Poetry in Production, which proposes nothing less than a new approach to hearing Black sound as a radical form of sonic insurgence. Our third speaker will be Maureen Mahon, Associate Professor of Music at NYU, whose powerful new book, Black Diamond Queens, African-American Women and Rock and Roll, not only repositions Black women in the story of rock and roll, but also prompts us to rethink the historical narrative of pop altogether. And finally, our fourth speaker, Eric Weisbard, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Alabama, will tell us about how listening informed the creation of his hugely imaginative refiguring of the scholarly dictionary as a kind of intertext of sound and word, Songbooks, the literature of American popular music. Nina, Josh, and I will be serving as interlocutors, and we'll begin with Shanna and Nina.
Thank you so much, Ron. Shana, it's so wonderful to be together in this space here with you. I've had the distinct joy of being able to speak with you about this book as colleagues and friends and interlocutors. But I realized, reading it and rereading it, that I never asked you what you actually listened to when you were writing the book. I read about the music you wrote about, but I don't know what was in your mind and your heart and in your sonic environment as you were writing the book. And I know that Paul Robeson took you to so many different places. And I'm also wondering if the sounds of those places may have informed the way that you wrote this book. So, Shana, I am so curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished panel. I'm fans of everyone on this panel, and it's really lovely to be in conversation with everyone and to virtually see folks, including you, Nina, who I should be seeing most every day, but I'm not. So the question of what I was listening to when I wrote is, as Maureen earlier mentioned, a dense and kind of anxiety producing one, because as music scholars, I know whenever someone asks me, what are you listening to, even impromptuly in the moment, I feel a certain amount of pressure to say the right thing, right? So as I'm thinking back on my writing process, it was helpful just to take the pressure off and to name a few things to which I was listening, or that I can clearly identify as something to which I was listening. And the period that I kind of zeroed in on was the moment of fall 2017, which is when I was doing research abroad for the project. So I spent about a month and a half in Wales and England doing research for the book. And so I was trying to think about, well, fall 2017, what was I listening to? And thankfully, your iTunes have timestamps and things, so I could dig a little bit to refresh my memory. And I realized that I was listening pretty similar to how I would normally listen. So this is not kind of a roll call of the texts from the book, although there is an overrepresentation of those in the larger catalog. But as I was thinking about being in Wales, for example, and just walking around, walking to the bus, hiking up the hill to the archive, doing those things, I was listening to my phone, to my iTunes list. And some of the things that stuck out to me were works by Monique Bingham, who's a house musician and singer, who I was listening to at that moment. She has a best of compilation that I would listen to still pretty regularly, but at that time was heavily in rotation, in part because I had that spring been watching the first season of World of Dance, where Les Twins, who are dancers from France, used her work in their performances. And so I was introduced to her through their performances, and through her performances, I was introduced to Black Coffee, who I was ashamed to not have known of, who's a kind of super producer and DJ from South Africa. So all of those, chain link reactions that happen as you're listening were present in that moment as well. So I was listening to her and, feeling very much like I was still in diaspora in that moment, right? Wales, this place where Black folks are radically underrepresented, right? Where I was not seeing many folks who looked like me, but nonetheless, they were always in my ears. And so I felt very much at home at a certain level, thinking about house and its relationship to Detroit, to the Midwest where I'm from, to the rest of the world. So she was a big influence in me feeling kind of settled in this strange place. But also, as I'm want to do in my research practice, wanting to feel like I'm comfortable. And, sometimes the work is not always that. And so to be able to return to the vibrations that actually feel familiar, that feel sustaining to me was really important. Another one of those artists I was listening to was Tyler, the Creator, whose album Flower Boy came out in 2017. And that album was really my most kind of solid introduction to him. Tyler was someone who, as he was working with Odd Future and things, I was not a super big fan of. There was a way in which I think portrayals of him, some of which were advanced by him, but some of which were imposed upon him, trafficked in this kind of fatalistic horror show that he was meant to kind of portray. And with Flower Boy, it was a front to back album for me. I could listen straight through and feel all types of emotions. Yes, there was that element of, kind of the macabre, but there was also all of these opportunities for vulnerability and kind of emotional fluidity that I just did not anticipate from him. So it was just a really beautiful reintroduction to someone who had been, I think, pretty pigeonholed in public discourse. And I love that album still to this day. So that was something I was listening to. But also with that album, something that is really important to me is having kind of an emotional scope to my listening practice. So not only was he demonstrating that and revealing some interiority, but also for me, he would go from these very kind of flowery, beautifully melodic tunes to like these really aggressive, hard tracks like Who Dat Boy. And there were these moments where I found myself just in that transition, getting hype as I walked into the archive or as I walked into St. Paul's Cathedral in order to like listen for the book and things like that. So, those different pitches of the listening experience were really important. And he brought a lot of that to the table. I was also listening to some classics. So the Whispers, It Only Hurts for a Little While, I heard in a bar in New York the week before I boarded the plane to go to Wales, and Shazammed it there in the bar because I hadn't heard it before. And it just has this incredible like cadence to it that is just really animating. And of course, the language of It Only Hurts for a Little While is entirely apropos of our work process sometimes, and certainly was on my birth and delivery soundtrack a year and a half later, just as a little bit more animation and encouragement. But that song, also keeping me attuned to these various genealogies that I'm also trying to track throughout the book, that this is not just a book about one man who lived one lifetime. This is about a man who inspired many lifetimes through his impact on the communities that he served. And so being able to switch between Tyler, the Creator, and the Whispers, and Denise Williams, who was playing as we waited. All of these people were actually in rotation at that time. And of course, last but not least, Paul Robeson was very much in my ears for a whole host of reasons. But in particular, this recording that I'm so thankful exists of his 1957 transatlantic concert between his studio in New York City and the Porthcawl Pavilion in South Wales, where he was communing with the Miners' Union in their choral festival. And so I was listening to this recording that I only came across as I was deep into the process for the book. And it became a really foundational resource in not only hearing the events of that historical moment, but also in trying to think differently about his voice in its kind of studio format, in its more raw do-it-yourself format. That was as close in some respects as I could get to his aliveness in recorded form, was through this transatlantic cable, the phone call that he made, through which he sung to thousands of people. So he was very central to my process, obviously, and someone who I continue to listen to today.
Thank you, Shana, for bringing us right into your world. I can smell the ocean of Wales now. I'm wondering, when you listen to Paul Robeson, to this transatlantic concert, when your listening process is to listen in order to be able to write about it, is that different or similar, or has a large overlap with when you listen to create a kind of environment for yourself to write within? Does that make sense as a distinction?
Yeah, it does.
I know that you have such a sophisticated listening practice. I want to hear.
Yeah, no, I think for all of us, there's going to be some overlap for sure, right? That the listening practice informed by your writing or your research carries over just into your leisurely. For many of us, all of us, perhaps leisurely listening is maybe a fiction, right? That it doesn't exist in the way that some people may consider leisurely listening. Because sometimes I find myself being too overly analytical, or I find myself kind of listening in isolation on any of these tracks in ways that are really curious and interesting to me, but by which I'm actually missing the forest for the trees sometimes, But yes, I think in general, my listening for writing is a little bit more intentionally intensive, and that I, do a lot of stopping and starting, moving back 3 seconds, trying to catch that pause or that breath or that modulation or whatever is happening. And I think with the listening for Paul Robeson, because I've really only ever listened to him analytically. I was not a fan before I started writing about him. I really came to him through the research and then became a fan. So for those reasons, I've only really ever listened to him in that way. But still, even in the research, coming across recordings of for example, his version of Oasis and Osiris, right? That piece, when it came up in my reading and I was able to find a recording of it, I just wanted to listen to first as a fan. I didn't want to overanalyze it because there were maneuvers that he was making and a kind of framework that he was building around his performance that was significant for me to understand as an audience member rather than an analyst first, right? And so I think I wanted to move back and forth with him in order to pull back a little bit on some of the scalpeling that I would do in my listening practice and just kind of be immersed in it, for the sake of trying to understand initially the motivation for even choosing a song like this, rather than, well, what then types of artistic or stylistic choices does he make in the performance? So I was moving kind of in and out with him as I was discovering pieces that were new to me or were outside of his typical repertoire, and finding a lot of joy in that, actually. And also, as I mentioned, St. Paul's Cathedral, just sitting in there, of course, I can't hear his voice in that space. I was listening to the boys' choir, but still trying to listen for him, even as some kind of faint trace in the architecture of that space. So I think the listening practice did definitely change, but I have to be a little bit more mindful about how to make those adjustments as I'm in the situation.
Well, to me, this book is a lesson in modulating our listening in multiple ways and in multiple directions, and it opens up the form and the function of listening in astonishing new ways. And it's a work that I'll return to again and again, and which I think should be signed to every music theory class, every musical skills class, you know.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much for bringing this whole new world into our listening, to voices, to spaces, to times that intersect. And Shanna, thank you so much for sharing.
It was my honor
today and for being part of our series. I want to turn it over to another author in our series now, and another co-editor with me, Ron and Anthony.
Thank you both. It's a challenge, Anthony, I think, after hearing what they had to say, to remain constrained within our pre-designates, but certainly the sense of the capacious effect of sound reproduction that could allow Shanna to be listening for Robeson in a far off place. That could not happen without the phonographic. And indeed, the idea of listening while we're writing, it assumes that we have in place sound reproduction. We couldn't otherwise do it unless we had the Esterhazy orchestra before us. So there is a sense that the phonographic is intruding in our world, and at the same time, it is really very much what becomes so important to you with the concept of phonographic poetry, which is such a fascinating take, and sound. The idea of the soundtrack would seem also to occupy Soundworks. I wonder if you could speak, as you wish, to the ways in which the activity of listening informs your understanding of your own book, and what you want for us to understand about the practice itself. You're muted, Anthony.
I think "you're muted" is really the like the phrase of both 2020 and now 2021. Is just so recurrent. I just was saying, thank you. That's really a great question, and it lets me. I'll try to be brief to save some time, and maybe I'll first just say that the title. This book has had many lives and many versions. There was once a version, as I think you know, Ron, that was really rooted in early sound reproduction, and not just phonographic, but also I was thinking about how sound circulated, the kind of sheet music, which we see traces of in Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk and Worlds of Color. But the title I settled on is an homage really to Jay Dilla, who on his last album, Donuts, had two songs, Airworks and Lightworks. And it made me, those titles really, the track stuck with me. What he did with those stuck with me. Once upon a time, I had a blog that was thinking about him as what I used the term anarchivist, both there's something anarchistic, but also deeply archival, a kind of deep love that reflects the way that he listened to music. And one of those, he takes a little vocal gesture of Teddy Pendergrass, like the kind of dying end of a phrase, and loops it. And I wanted to capture something of that listening. Practically speaking, my soundtrack while writing really was a lot of William Parker's groups, especially his quartet, the quartet with Rob Brown and Louis Barnes, and the In Order to Survive quartet that I can listen to at some moments, Cecil Taylor's Field Trio, and certainly Cecil Taylor's music is what largely got me into this project. Henry Threadgill's sextet and his Zuid groups have been constantly playing while I write. There are limited things I can listen to and write that allow me to kind of do what I need to do with the time that I have. I would say, just to open things up, I want to just cite two other things. As far as the soundtrack, I was working on copy edits during, last year after March. So, and during the time of writing the book, we welcomed 2 children to our family. And so the sounds of them running about and playing and calling to each other and wrestling and fighting and all of that is very much a part of how the book is shaped. And no doubt, if there are lapses of attention, I'm not going to blame anybody else but my own self. But surely there are times when I started an idea, broke off, and then tried to figure out what I was doing. And it just seems important to acknowledge that. And it's part of the reason why they're in the dedication. But the other thing that really resonated with me, as just a quick anecdote, there was a wonderful coincidence that changed the trajectory of the book. One is a well-meaning colleague who had read the manuscript as part of my file for promotion, wanted to pull me aside and tell me that what I was writing about was really an American story, by which I understood him to mean he was wondering why white Americans weren't more centered in the story about jazz, which really made me think that I needed to think about how did we get to the point of calling jazz or creative music America's classical music, and what are the stakes of that? Because I wasn't going to start writing about Paul Bley. He's fine, but that work exists. And at the same time, this is around 2015 or so, Kamasi Washington emerged as a kind of media phenomenon. And there was all of this commentary around the Epic, the 3-disc album that he put out. And I listened to it. And, this is an annoying or an obnoxious musician thing that I'm going to say, and I don't mean it insultingly. I mean it very sincerely. I put it on and thought, oh yeah, I get this. He's grooving with Passion Dance. This sounds like a McCoy Tyner record. And this sounds like these other things to me. And especially Pharoah Sanders. It sounds like the post-Coltrane Pharoah Sanders groups on albums like Black Unity. And I was really struck by the fact that a lot of the commentary around him in the press was like, wow, this heralds a new beginning and a new direction for jazz, which was hard for me because it just sounded like stuff that I had been immersed in for so long. So that led me to really say, I think we're not listening to the music of the late 60s and the 70s. And that led me to really want to unearth and listen to that again, to try as much as I could as a critic to strip away all of my presumptions about what that was, what that music was about, and to really hear it and to read the interviews and read how people shaped, try to anyway, shape their audiences, try to shape what the music was about, and to see what we might recover beyond the sort of American story narrative and the kind of America's classical music, and indeed beyond America, although this version of the argument, this section of the argument, because I'm still thinking about it, is largely focused on the US. So I would call those things the kind of really the soundtrack, but especially it's funny, and I'll just acknowledge, even though I bristled at it, being challenged to think about this as an American story, which I still didn't do, it helped me figure out what it was I did want to do and why I wanted to raise some of the questions that I did in the ways that I did.
That's really fascinating. And it does bring up a kind of methodology that you engage, that you seem to be very interested in what you call a sound text, which is a figuration that many of us embrace of the kind of interplay of sound and word and discourse, as well as the forces that are unspoken, of ideological forces, and really kind of pushing against that. You have that lovely lovely metaphor of the unheard, which is coming from Mackie, but you're seeming to bring it forward. So what I hear in your book is this sense that we're in the process of navigating, or one is engaging in the process of navigating through this sound text, but you're also proposing an intervention. And I think it might be important for us to hear a little bit about that before we turn.
I think there are a few interventions that I'm trying to make, and I'll say that the other shaping question for me became, how is it that we came to think of sound as Black sound as one, distinct, and two, as an index of Black resistance, as index of concrete political struggles. And this was really me challenging myself. I found that I had fallen into a posture of saying, you know, this just resists that, or Ornette Coleman is resisting the strictures of bebop and extending and so forth. It was kind of easy for me to do. And the easier it became, the more suspicious I became of it as an impulse, and started to wonder, what might I be missing? And what I thought I was missing was the fact that so often when you read the interviews, you know, Coleman or Archie Shepp, even John Coltrane, they're not really that concerned about white listeners or the press. They're not really thinking about, oh, I hope Leonard Feather likes this record. I mean, Coltrane spends in an interview a long time just defending Eric Dolphy after he thought Eric Dolphy had gotten been mistreated by, I think, John Tynan in a review, and just saying, like, look, Eric is making beautiful music, leave him alone. And that sense of, like, what if we really could hear that these people, these musicians, they're making music and they're worried about things that are beyond what my impulse as a critic was to say that they're worried about. And so that led me to one of the interventions, which is to really insist on tradition as a process rather than a thing, and to think about the processes by which, so tradition, the etymology is this is a handing down, and so to really think about what's handed down and how, but also what meanings accrue to the sound that relate to particular moments and particular struggles, and the ways that there's a residue. We think of Archie Shepp as the angry Black tenor man, and we think of him as related to a particular moment of Black power politics, and for good reason. I mean, Shepp was known to quote Chairman Mao in interviews, so it's not that it's false, but it is to say that understanding doesn't really help us to hear what Shepp is doing. And so really wanting to get to a place where I could take it seriously and think about just what is he doing, and get to a place where I could describe it. What is he trying to build? How is he really working with not just Mao, but someone like Robert Williams, and the idea of creating self-sustaining independent Black institutions as a means towards liberation, whose success is uneven and is unevenly distributed, as he himself acknowledged at different points. Really wanting to sit with that. And my metaphor there is via Nathaniel Mackey to unheard, and there's a play there, heard like as one does with cattle, but also heard, the past tense of hear, and the ways that the ways we're inclined to hear can overwrite the thing that we're listening to.
I love that dialectic that goes on with that figure of the herding of sheep, and also the kind of intrusion into that. And I have a feeling that we could go on for a long time on this theme, but we only have a minute or so left. And I wonder if we might want to bring it back a bit to the notion of listening while writing, and to what extent, as Josh and Nina and I were speaking when we were planning this, I don't listen at all when I'm writing. And I wonder if I'm an outlier. I wonder to what extent listening is a kind of presupposition for you, or do you like the quiet?
I generally listen to music when writing, and part of that is I'm often writing in environments where the only way I can control them, I can control for other people who might be around me is by listening. But it also, in a paradoxical way, it can quiet the voices of doubt, the voices of imagined critics, and just kind of people who get in my way. I can quiet that down if I can just put on that Coltrane record and sit with it for a minute. Then I can really hear my own voice. And certainly when I edit, I still listen sometimes, but I'm also really listening to the shape of sentences and hoping that they do what they need to do. But weirdly enough, I find that there's so few places that I have access to that are quiet reliably, that my habit is just to turn on music in order to write or to read.
Excuse me, I was trying to shut off my timer. I think our time's up, but thank you. That's really quite evocative, and I find your work just enormously satisfying and challenging, and I look forward to further conversation. Just as Shanna's book is perhaps the new requirement for music theorists, I think yours was joining the club. Thank you. I'll turn it to Josh now.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ron. Maureen, where are you?
I'm on my way.
Come into the profile land. So great to see you, Maureen.
It's so nice to see you, Josh.
You know, I was thinking back on, I mean, we've known each other for a long time, and I feel like so much in this book, I've, you know, like many probably on this call, have heard you rehearsing some of these ideas for a long time, but I felt like I've been listening alongside you for a while, and learning about listening from you. And I was really taken in the introduction to the book. You actually start the book with a kind of listening biography. And I'm wondering if you could talk about why that was important for you to put your past listening practices at the beginning of your new listening practices.
Sure. And I'll just quickly thank you and Nina and Ron for inviting me to come out today. And of course, thank Ken Wissaker for giving us this series and giving me a place in it. So I actually didn't want to write that personal narrative section. I was very resistant to it. And our colleague and friend, Guthrie Ramsey, and I were talking, and he insisted that I should write such a section. And I had to think about why I was so resistant to it. And I really wanted the focus to be on the women who I was researching and learning about. But I realized that I was the narrator of the tale, and that I was coming from a very specific perspective. And this is all stuff I knew as an anthropologist. We always talk about the positionality of the ethnographer. And so I decided I should just, you know, kind of bite the bullet and try to tell this story and try to have fun writing it. But the comment I made when we were getting ready for the call about the anxiety that, you know, revealing your listening practices promotes actually grows out of the story that I was telling about the racial dynamics of listening and the ways, you know, depending on what your racial and gender identity is, there are assumptions about what you're supposed to listen to. And I was just really never in the right place. And so that's a longstanding source of anxiety that I'm actually comfortable with. And I'm not going to change what I listen to because people think for some reason I should be listening to something else. But there's still like, it's almost like PTSD, I guess, from high school. So, so I wanted to talk about those artists. And I think the thing that I became aware of as I was writing the book, and it was a very long slog, so I was listening to a lot of stuff along the way. The thing I became aware of is that I was writing about artists who I actually had not listened to very much as a, as a fan listener. And so the book was really an opportunity for me to do a deep dive into music that's a part of the history of rock and roll, but it wasn't really the soundtrack of my growing up. So I talk about what I listened to was really music that came in after the period that I'm writing about. And so, a lot of punk and post-punk and new wave, and some of the artists who were sort of precursors to that music. And that's actually the music that I listened to a lot when I was writing the book, when I was actually doing, editing or kind of workaday tasks around the book. And then for researching the book, I was just immersed in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s rock and roll, alongside the music of the specific artists who I was writing about. So I was learning a lot, but it was new. It was new music. And as a result, I really didn't listen a lot to new music that was coming out during the time that I was writing. I'd listened to some, but it wasn't as much of a focus.
It's so interesting in a way. You're echoing something that Shana said about not necessarily being a kind of devout fan of Robeson before writing the book, and then listening to him constantly, as part of the research. Did your relationship to the music you started listening to for this book change your relationship to those songs? Like, did you become a fan? Have you been listening to things differently now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the only music I'd really listened to a lot, I'm probably overlooking something, but was really the girl group music. Because I love the girl group music. And my first, when I was about 5 years old, my older sister gave me the Phil Spector "A Merry Christmas to You" album. And at first I didn't want it because it was what I considered a big people record. And I was more comfortable with 7-inch. I'm very old, so this was all records. I only had 45s that I would play on my record player. But she said, no, I think you'll like this. And so that was the Ronettes and Darlene Love and the Crystals. And so I just love that music. So that's always been in my ear. And to me, it's not Christmas unless I've heard Darlene Love sing. But I became, very fanish, and Betty Davis, actually, I was familiar with before going into this. But I became very fanish about LaBelle, especially Tina Turner, who I mentioned in the book, hadn't really felt connected to. I sort of liked her as a person, but I hadn't really spent a lot of time with her music. I knew the hits. And I just really developed a deep appreciation for her. And then for the background vocalists, who I spend a chapter talking about, some of what I did, I don't talk about it so much in the book, but I did a lot of listening to the recordings, the solo recordings that they made, that can be hard to find because they didn't really circulate the way they had hoped when they released them. So I spent time with that music. So I would say that, over time, I developed that appreciation.
There's one of my favorite moments in the book is what I've come to think of as like the Betty Davis moment, in that chapter where you talk about meeting her and speaking with her. And you say that you refer to, quote, your efforts to squeeze an articulated Black feminist critique from Davis fell flat. And I wonder if you could talk about that idea of squeezing an articulated Black feminist critique in general, about listening. So you had heard it in her music, but she wasn't willing to give it to you when you spoke to her.
No, she wasn't. And I should be very clear, I did not meet her. It was a great disappointment that I didn't meet her. We talked on the phone. And she was really nice, but she just wasn't going down that path. And I think it's actually something that it makes sense for a woman of her generation, and the generation of the women who I talk about are roughly in that, like Tina Turner is probably the oldest, born in 1939, but women born in the 40s, African-American women born in the 40s, weren't necessarily signing on to feminism because feminism as they were understanding it in the 70s and 80s was like white women's stuff. And they were just doing it. They were just doing what a lot of us would define as feminist work. So I tried in that, in that moment in the interview to hear if she had something to say about that, but I didn't make a big point of trying to label these artists as feminists. I just wanted to talk about them as someone who identifies herself as a Black feminist and to think about the significance of their work in that regard. But she, I think I say in that, around that same place, I say that I think she didn't spend time thinking in those terms. She just wanted to do the work and she just wanted to get her art out there. That was her focus. And that focus led her to do certain things like, taking over the production of her recordings at a time when most women were not allowed, most artists weren't allowed to be producers, and certainly not most women were able to be producers. She took that on. And I think that's the part that's significant, and what, we can argue over terminology, but I like the, emphasis on the practice.
In writing the book, or maybe even after you finished it and since, has it taught you anything about different ways to listen? Has it changed your approach to how you listen to music?
I think the thing it changed is I was always someone who would buy records, but I kind of bought records indiscriminately. I wasn't what I would label a completist. Like, I just really didn't care. I just wanted, there's just something I wanted to buy, and I'd buy it, and then I'd, buy something else. And in order to talk about these artists, I had to be more of a completist, and, to try to get a sense of trajectory and to have more of an understanding of where they were at different moments. And so that part was different. And I think the other thing is, I think I realized that I was actually listening to music less as I was writing this book, because when I was actually doing the work of writing, I was spending so much time listening, and I don't know what it was exactly. It's like I couldn't think of what to listen to other than this music. And so, and that's continued even after finishing, where I think would always play music all the time before. I don't have that kind of wall-to-wall sound the way I used to. So I think it's more, I guess it's more intentional and more focused when I do listen.
So we're almost out of time. So last quick question is, from all the things that you listen to in order to write this book, has there been one piece of music, one song that kind of has taken on a different life for you after the book and has stayed as a part of your listening life?
Oh gosh. I always kind of resist. Is there one?
Sure.
Only one. But the first thing that came to mind when you asked that is the song "Gimme Shelter," because that's a song that I thought I knew pretty well. And then at some point, someone pointed out to me that there was a Black woman singing on that song, and of course I had heard her, but I didn't really hear her. And so now, when I hear that song, I hear it very differently. And I think, just related to that more broadly, I hear Black women background voices on the sort of classic rock songs in a different way than I used to when I was listening, just kind of more recreationally.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maureen.
Thank you, Josh.
And I think I'm going to rotate Eric in with my magical Zoom powers. There he is.
Hello again.
Hello. So actually, something Maureen brought up made me think about you, which I hope you see as a positive thing, around the question of completist listening, and kind of when to be discriminating with listening. I always imagine you, Eric, like surrounded by this like mountain of CDs. And I remember you on Facebook, when you were driving a lot, would post about basically what CDs were lining the floor of your car in order for you to take the drive. So, I mean, listening is a central part of your life. Could you talk about maybe the differences between the listening you do every day versus the listening you do in order to write a book like Songbooks?
Sure. And as with everybody else, thank you for inviting me. Thanks for having me be part of this amazing book series and with such cool people as part of this session. So thanks. The crazy thing about me is I was a completely like meat and potato rock critic of the 20th century at the last moment it was possible to be that. I got paid to listen to records and write about them as quickly as humanly possible and then go on to something else. And when that essentially died, I had to change the nature of my writing and the nature of my listening. And that's gone through a lot of different iterations, which would take way more than the 15 minutes we've got here. But when I got to Songbooks and I was writing this utterly insane overview of 250 years of books on American music, it was clear to me that I would not be a completist in this category. I would be a dilettante again and again and again. And so I actually had to sort of shift my listening from that kind of rock critic way where you try to get on top of things to a kind of listening that accepted that you wouldn't always get on top of things. And so I created sort of these weird new patterns of listening, and they sustained me through this book project. If you'll indulge me, I'll explain to people, I think you know about this, my strange Friday habit. So my job is in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, but I live in Nashville, Tennessee. So that's a 3.5 hour drive when COVID's not keeping me here. I go down on a Tuesday and come back on a Thursday. So I have 7 hours a week of pretty dedicated driving and listening to music. And that exactly overlapped with this book project. I started the book as I started to have that divide. So on Fridays, I would simply ask on Facebook what records had just been posted on Spotify that Friday. And I would start with a few, and then my friends, including you, Josh, from time to time would volunteer suggestions. And I'd quickly make a playlist of the, say, 6 or 7 albums that had come out that week that people were interested in. And I'd hit shuffle, and I'd have essentially a jukebox for just that week. And my habit was to listen over the weekend while I was still in Nashville on shuffle at the gym, get to kind of know a few of the songs, see which things seem worth diving into. And then on the drives, listen straight through to the ones that I wanted to listen to. And so my insane thing, it's hard to even give it one example or another, was just week in and week out, except that only for that week would I be listening to those 6 or 7 albums, get as much humanly possible out of them, and then see what was left of me the next week as I went on to something different. And I was doing the exact same thing in the book project. So I became the shallowest person imaginable.
So let's talk more about Songbooks itself. As you mentioned, it is it's a big effort. It's an event of a book in a lot of ways. And I'm just wondering, because, I know that you had to cut a lot. Like there were countless books that you didn't write about.
Wow.
But were you listening to music related to every book as you were writing? Like when you were writing about, the early Psalm book, were you listening to Psalms?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, one of the great changes, and I'm sure you can attest to this just as well, that's happened in the 21st century is we listen to books as we read them now in a way that we couldn't do nearly so easily before streaming. We choose to stop and go on YouTube to listen to the song that's being referenced or check out the performance. We have all these detours from reading that become listening. And that wasn't possible before. And it really has changed, I think, how we relate the concept. My broader argument is that in the 20th century, it was all about footnotes and citing other postmodern authors. And then in the 21st century, it's become this process of sending people to YouTube and say, no, you got to hear this. And it's really reshaped the nature of things. For this project, weirdly, I did much less of that kind of listening. I was more listening for the voices of the authors, I think. So I would get obsessed with the question of how multiple authors are writing about cosmopolitanism as a kind of way of grouping ethnomusicology, or how one author in the 1950s was insisting on the vernacular as something to care about. And I would quote these writers much more extensively than I would in other kinds of writing practice, because I wanted readers to hear the voices of those writers. So in a weird way, my emphasis shifted from listening to music as I read to actually almost insisting that the only voice I should be hearing is the prose voice.
Were you imagining ever the authors you were writing about, what they were listening to? Like, did you learn things about them as listeners as much as you did about as writers?
Yes and no. I think that in a weird way, this book became my umpteenth version of alternative music. So like when I started, my little niche was Spin magazine and alternative rock, and finding an alternative to the Rolling Stone magazine baby boomer rock narrative. So that was alternative number one. And Lord knows, with the pop conference and other things along the way, a million other kinds of alternatives have come along. I think that in pursuing this project, where I was as interested in what Dreiser or Los Bros Hernandez were getting out of music in their work, as I was in the fact that that very early Love and Rockets comic strip totally needed to reference Six Pack by Black Flag. It was kind of both. It was the combination of how listening to a Black Flag song at the right moment becomes part of the way Love and Rockets changes the comic strip. And it's that intersection of music shaping choices people make about how to use words. In some ways, that puts my book in conversation with Anthony's, although again, from this incredibly more dilettantish perspective. Because it is, Songbooks and Soundworks in a way are almost the same move. It's literature and music, it's words and sound. But in my case, it's song, and that way in which a song done quickly, capturing things on the fly. You might write a song in 10 minutes and it could still be lasting because there was something in the air that day.
Right. So that the idea that you brought up, the important idea that you mentioned about reading, pausing, going to YouTube, reading, Spotify, whatever. Is there a moment that you might recall or share with us from the writing of the book where maybe you did that, and did that alter the way you wrote?
I would say that the moment that was most daunting for me was I was reading Will Friedwald's insane book. I think it's called A Biographical Guide to the Great Jazz and Pop Singers. And in my little entry, and this is typical of my prose, I called it a hot dog eating contest, because he literally like swallows down as many albums as humanly possible in a lifetime of listening. And I was very aware in accusing him of that I was accusing myself of the same thing. So, I made a massive Spotify playlist of all the albums that Will Friedwald was talking about by people I'd never heard of. And I just spent like a couple of weeks shuffling through the mammoth world of Will Friedwald, who's one of the quirkier human beings you'll ever encounter anyway. So that was one example, but the book has a lot of entries and we can only go so far. But it was moments like that, sort of taking a little detour. Sometimes it was about straightforward listening. A lot of time it wasn't. And I would argue that the other thing that's a big change in 21st century listening is we mostly don't just sit down and listen to records anymore. We put music into kind of a million different intersectional points of reference. And that's what I was more trying to do, wander around between things.
Maybe for the last question, Eric, I want to go back to something you said about your kind of earlier professional listening history. Sure. In the context of spin and rock. And what I'm wondering if you now consider the way you listen to be different from that, and maybe a more expansive listening. Have you noticed, looking back on your life as a listener, that sometimes when people think, as you get older, you get more niche in what you listen to. And I'm wondering if that's actually the opposite for you.
Yeah, for me, if I'm not listening to new records that have just come out that week, I don't deserve to get to listen to older ones. There's a weird balancing act. If I'm going to be the teacher teaching the same songs year after year, I've got to keep alive some other way. So that's part of it. And then the other thing is, I just do different things now. So this book is sort of a weird sequel to the very first book I ever worked on, the Spin Alternative Record Guide, which had 60 odd writers and 400 entries on different musicians from ABBA to John Zorn. And back then, wrestling with the idea of what an alternative rock lineage might look like really was about, getting Alex Ross to make you that cassette tape of every cool New Zealand pop song you needed to hear. That we've all given that up. Or maybe that's just completely uninteresting at this point. So now I think the challenge is more sort of epistemological or authorial. We grapple with how this stuff should be dealt with in terms of meaning. We grapple with how to make it effective and resonant, to teach people about it. We sort of, it used to be that so much was involved with, I get a promotional CD for free in the mail, you don't. I'm writing across that line and trying to give you advice as a sympathetic but entitled person about whether you should spend your $14.98. Now it's much more about, does music matter enough? And can I help in the ways I write about it, make it matter? It's a completely different equation, and it changes the nature of every sentence I write.
That's great. It's actually a great kind of ethos, I think, that we've been trying to gravitate towards throughout the series, is this question of meaning, music and meaning, and why music matters. What does it mean to different people, for what reasons? And I'm just so thrilled that that your book is the most recently published, or about to be published any time now. And just wanted to thank you and everybody, all of the authors, for being a part of this, and of course for being part of this series, which I know I think I can speak for Ron and Nina. This series is such an opportunity and such a gift to be able to just be learning with everybody, but it's constantly transforming and changing the way I think about listening and the way I think about music. So it's a real honor. And I think, Nina, you're gonna join us back in to handle some group questions, maybe.
I will, yes. And we're so, we've been talking a lot about the series, of course, and the series is housed within Duke University Press. And we're so lucky to have Ken Whisaker here, the editor that we're working with there to develop the series. And Ken works very, very closely with each of the authors as well. And I wanted to just bring you into the conversation, Ken. I know that you think a lot about your own listening practice and your listening practice in relationship to these books and the authors we have here today, and all the authors you're working with. And I know you have a question on your mind.
Well, thank you so much for doing this, Nina, and Josh and Ron as well. It's really rare in my experience that you get to have a series thought about in this kind of coherent way, and it's extremely helpful and useful, and it's just really fabulous to hear from Shana and Maureen and Eric and Anthony. It's really great. And the way you introduced the series, it made me think a lot about the weight of the word I often overlook, which is refiguring. For a long time, I used to think it was like reframing or something. I had to keep reminding, look down and see it. And a lot of times series have names and they don't actually really help you point toward what the series is at all. Like I think of the Lisa Lowe, Jack Halberstam Perverse Modernity series, which really developed queer of color critique. And you can kind of draw from Perverse Modernities to that. It all makes sense, but it's not like what you might have retrospectively decided to name it. But listening today, that idea of refiguring was like super present and helpful. And going back to your conversation with Shana about biography and who's a biography for, and whose story you're telling multiple stories, not the story of one person's life. And for some reason, I flashed on a book that we did that predated the series, which was the Horace Tapscott As Told To memoir. And the way that that was reflected back to me by George Lipsitz and Cherry Tucker as like, oh, what's important here is this is a different way of being a jazz person in the community. Instead of trying to like have your biggest career or be in the papers as much as possible, you're in this place in Los Angeles where you all are, and you're like in interaction with the people around you. And so I started to think about like the kind of form of biography and what Shana's accomplished in her book as doing something similar in terms of telling the story of those interactions. And I thought it might be interesting to hear, because I then heard like different forms of refiguring and what Anthony was saying and what Maureen was saying, what Eric was saying. If people want to reflect on that, like what the narrative that they came into was, how that was reformed or refigured in what they did in their own work.
We're going to bring back all the authors as highlights, and maybe we can start with Shana. If you like, Shana, to reflect on that question.
Sure, I'll just be brief. I mean, I think the biographical form is one that I never intended to participate in, and everyone, thankfully, who was party to the publication of the work was on board with that and encouraging me in thinking through, certainly in evidencing some material presence for this person who is so animating in the project, but certainly not at the limit of biography, that it was always intended to be something that was not only attempting to reimagine or to better understand kind of people's relationship to this person and his form. So it was not just about his form, it was also the form of the project itself, that in reimagining, reframing who he was to people, I necessarily had to write differently in order to present that to the people who had already delivered it to me. And so it was really a charge to think with those communities rather than on behalf of or in lieu of or in all of these other ways that sometimes befalls us as academics.
Somebody want to jump in?
I can take a very quick crack at it. One thing that my three co-presenters have in common today is they've all been part of our Popular Music Books in Process series, which happens every Tuesday. I'm being a little promotional here, but I'm also just encouraging people on this call to check that out. And one of the ways that I've approached this question of refiguring music, first with the pop conference and now with this book series, has been to just try to create spaces where the multiplicity can bloom. Not anything elaborate, just trying to bring a bunch of people together and allow that range to tell a story that wouldn't be persuasive coming from any one single voice. In a different way, I'm doing that with this book with its 160 entries. I like the process of letting things that turn out to have a kinship that isn't always immediately apparent achieve some kind of proximity and then let things play out over time. For me, that's been how I have ended up approaching a lot of what was available when that world of sort of the Village Voice music section stopped being the only place to do it in.
I think I would say for my part, I'm really drawn to the term refiguring, which will be no surprise to those of you who've read any of the book. And it's really an invitation to think about how music is figured in the first place and how what some would call the paratext, the reviews, the interview, the profile, and all of those things go into and are part of our listening, but also the ways that, convenient shorthands, term jazz, for example, does a lot to, it obscures as much as it enables, or an idea like tradition. In one chapter, I put Matana Roberts together with Archie Shepp to say, we can read them in a tradition, but there are all of these key distinctions between them, so that to hear them together would actually requires finding some other point of contact. And in doing that, it requires a different historical attention and interest to this thing, American music. And of course, Roberts now, as I understand it, lives in the UK. So what does it mean to say that her music is American at all? It's American in reference. She is from the United States and talks in interviews about her family linked to Louisiana, but it's an invitation to really think and to be open to the fact that it changes. It's not and I'm leaning into Eric. There's no, if or to Eric's project, as I understand it, if at one point there was this desire to pin down, this music is the American music, and Du Bois would say that the sorrow songs and Native American music is that, and others would want to really insist that there's this music that's somehow an index of an American spirit, that to refigure that is to really put that aside and start from a different, chart out from a different trajectory.
I think for me, the word refiguring resonated a great deal, because in the project, I'm asking us to listen differently to the history of rock and roll, and to listen with an ear to the presence of African-American women, and not just a presence, but an influential presence. So I think it was a very fortuitous match to be on the series.
Thank you so much for such an evocative question, Ken, and again for making a home for our series and for these books. I always talk with authors, new authors who come to me, and ask them to just imagine which bookshelf they want to be on amongst which books, and I always feel very happy to be amongst the books of the authors who we see here now, and many more at the Duke University Press. And we have another author who has a great question here posted in the chat, Barry Shank, and we're going to spotlight him, and so he can ask his question directly.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, everybody. This was a great opportunity to listen to some of your thinking processes and some of your listening practices. And I am curious about the role of tradition, as Anthony defined it, as something within which people work against as much as within. And that struck me to be something that's partially or maybe largely true about your work as authors, and also about the work of the musicians that you're writing about. And so I'm asking if you all could reflect a little bit on this fraught concept, as Anthony's mentioned just recently, his most recent comment, like what role does a kind of conscious conceptualization of an artist's place or a writer's place in the historical range of work that's been done in this area? What does that mean to you? Did you think about it at all? And stuff like that.
Yeah, I guess if I might be so bold as to say that I approached the work and my kind of labors within a genealogy similarly to Paul Robeson. I mean, it's very, presumptuous of me to say, but I think Robeson was working in a way that was far more interested in legacy than he was tradition. That, his insistence and repetitive performance of, insistence on the significance of and repetitive performance of the Negro spirituals was really about him drawing forward and, being able to speak very clearly and passionately about to whom he belonged, right? To the people to whom he belonged. And so that for me, it reads far more as legacy than tradition, because it's not about trying to codify something that's already existing. That kind of legacy effort actually allows it to continually be dynamic and ever-changing and malleable and present in a way that is responsive and responsible. And so I would like to think that the work that I did on him is similarly functioning, that I'm working more in a legacy. And, you know, part of the work of the project, just as far as the literature is concerned, and Barry, you know, I've mentioned this in your presence before, is that, you know, there are things I'm writing against or writing in order to disrupt, right? Like this new left or the old left historiography of Robeson, which is not interested in his musical capacities at all, right? So there is a way in which I see myself kind of bucking certain traditions of writing, style-wise and content-wise. But, you know, the best ambitions from my work and is really following him in thinking about it as legacy, as being responsible to the people who actually made it possible for me to do this work and made it possible for a person like Robeson and for the communities he championed to have been successful and existed in the first place.
Yeah, that's great, Shana. And it also speaks to that other question about intervention in a tradition, you know, which creates a legacy, which establishes a new position from which new concepts and new sounds can develop and be heard. So yeah, thanks.
Exactly.
Anyone else?
Yeah, well, go ahead, Maureen.
I didn't think so much of the term tradition when I was working, Barry, but the canon was something that I was thinking about a great deal. And I was thinking about the ways canons are constructed, and then those constructions evaporate and we just take it as given that this is the canon. So I really wanted to take time to unpack the construction of the rock canon and think about why people who were there and participating weren't in the canon. And so that was a big part of the project.
Thank you. That's great.
I just would say briefly, really echoing Shana, that was so beautifully put. I think that for me, tradition has come to be, it's a term for describing how people and how I navigate, not a sense of responsibility to those who've come before me, wanting to kind of bear witness to and just respectfully represent work that's done, but also imagine who is going to come after me, who is going to read this, and to write and listen and analyze with an ear towards, you know, a real sense of obligation and a responsibility for communities, and for communities that often are neglected and are not considered. And just concretely, I'll just stick with Shep. There's a criticism of him that, oh, his early experimental music, it didn't have popular appeal, and all of those people, they had to go to Europe to find audiences. And there's this kind of sneering that I think is honestly condescending to working class listeners and poor listeners and just ordinary people who in fact did buy those records to listen to them. And just the sheer lack of curiosity that, oh gosh, there's dissonance and no one could listen to it. It fails to imagine, how did Shep think people would listen to it? How did Coltrane think people would listen to it? I don't think that anybody, and I won't go into a long thing, but to really sit with that, who did they imagine themselves touching, and what communities that they want to reach, but also shape for the future, is the positive account of tradition that I work with and work from.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Anthony. That's really, I think, it sounds to me to be exactly right. Eric?
At the center of my book is a section that's called Countercultural Vernacular. And it's basically that moment when the intellectual engagement with vernacular music had gotten to a point where people really thought this stuff was going to change the world. The next chapter or section is called After the Revolution, because it didn't, sorry. And so in a lot of ways, what this book is reckoning with is that story, is that ongoing way in which a whole bunch of different kinds of writers, helped by a whole bunch of different kinds of technological changes, came to hear in vernacular music, something they thought was truly revolutionary, and then how they dealt with the fact that its impact was not exactly what they thought it was going to be. So it's very much an engagement with something. I'm not sure the word tradition or intervention is quite right. What I'm hoping it's doing is it's providing a kind of new map, or a new way through all those books we find on the shelves every time we are allowed back into the university libraries, and to sort of start seeing how those things took the shape they did.
Yeah, that's very clear, and I think that's exactly what your book does. You know, it sets the world up in that way. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Barry, for that evocative question. Josh.
Yeah, I just want to thank you all for that. I just wanted to add a quick note, picking up a couple of threads from the conversation and bringing it in a way back to the question of the series itself, because we were focusing on the refiguring term, which was really wonderful. But I also want to, particularly for those on the call who maybe don't know the series all that well, to also come back to or underline the other two terms, right? To underline American, which we did talk about, but something that Ron and I, when I joined the series initially, Ron and I talked a lot about, and I know this has continued now in our kind of in the new shape that we're in with Nina, is blowing up that term American. And so we were really also, always thinking about American as a question mark, American as a site of critique, but also American in terms of political geography, and particularly colonial geography, and always thinking about it in terms of a much more hemispheric notion of what America is, the borders of America. And a lot of the books since, I think, have been grappling with that in interesting ways. Music that might originate in a place that is kind of designated as American, that takes on a life beyond the borders, et cetera. But also increasingly, and I kind of feel like there's some books that I think are going to be coming over the next couple of years that are also exploding the notion of music itself. And I think one of the longest conversations we had, Ron, way back was about Fred Moten's B. Jenkins. Was this book of poems a book about music? And I actually don't think it is a book about music as an object, but it's a book that lives within music. Anthony mentioned William Parker, and Parker's got this great idea of that every song has a song inside of it, right? Inside songs. And there's something in B. Jenkins that opened up my own thinking about what a series about music really is. Is it just about the things that we classify as music, or is it about a wider experience that becomes musical in our lives? And I think there's a couple of books in the pipeline that are going to be addressing that too. And in fact, this is, as I understand it, Nina, very much about what Peer Lab is also about.
Yeah, and if I could jump in here for just a moment, just to riff off of what you were suggesting, Josh, that this notion of music with a capital M, I think we're all quite aware of how much of a construct that is, and a construct that comes out of a tradition with a capital T that is inherited from Europe. And what's so problematic, and maybe what's so enabling about it, because it does also give us an object form that enables kind of exalted sense of art, for better or worse. But there's a whole conversation to be had about that. I just want to swing it back, though, to this very matter of listening. And I must say, I was just so blown away by this whole thing. And not only the diversity, but the disparity of conversations about, disparity of ideas about the practice of listening. How so, I hear myself coming in alignment with people, and then also thinking, hey, I don't agree with that at all. I don't listen that way at all. And it was quite wonderful and really quite exciting. And who knows, maybe we'll be able to carry this forward. But it's really thanks to Nina orchestrating this event and kind of bringing forward this idea of listening as a practice and as a motive. As a vehicle for our conversation. So thank you, Nina.
Well, thank you, Ron and Josh, for co-hosting this with me and for dreaming up the concept of this event today. And as Josh said, the peer lab, the practice-based experimental epistemology research lab is really about practice, how we do things and how we do things to figure things out, and to investigate that, to question that, to deepen that, and to think across practices and to cross-feed really between the senses is something that we are very interested in. And the conversation today was just right in the middle of that. So thank you so much for having that conversation with us. I want to remind everybody that starting today and for a month, you can use the event code PEER50 to purchase the books that we talked about. And then Eric's book, which will be coming out a little bit later this spring, is available for pre-order, and all these links will be put in the chat. So to enrich your life and to enrich your mind and to travel into multiple dimensions, if you haven't already, read these books, listen to these books, have a taste of these books. And we'll have another similar conversation to this about listening practice on May 27th. All our events will be on last Thursday of the month. So May, that falls on May 27. And the authors in that event are Daphne Brooks, Farah Griffin, and Gail Wald, all with a new book, a book very much in progress, and a book that is coming out in the fall. So it's again really about the practice. And again, I wanted to thank Ron and Josh for dreaming up this with me, for Duke University Press, and for Ken Whitaker, who was really our home, the RAM series home, the Peer Lab, who have been putting all this together with me, and especially the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music, who have helped fund this event, and the Peer Lab, and also have provided technical support. And of course, especially finally to Shana, to Maureen, to Eric, and to Anthony for your work and for your presence. The world is different because of that and better for that. And to everybody who's been here today, we really have enjoyed this time with you. And thank you so much for sharing this space with us. I hope we'll see you again on May 27th. Goodbye.
Thank you, Nina.